religion opposed to science? It's a question I know a lot of people in the world are asking and think they have an answer to. So we have four wonderful people that are going to join me now on stage to kind of lead us in a discussion this afternoon about this very topic. I think this morning everyone here is part of the Catholic University of America, which is really special. It says something great about Catholic University if you're looking for a college. There you go. All right, so here, starting on my left, I believe you're right, is Dr. Aaron Dominguez. He's the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at CUA and an ordinary professor of physics. His main area of research is in using particle colliders to search for new physics, including the recently discovered Higgs boson, which he said he'll tell us about because I don't know what that means, but I think it's very important. He studied at Whitman College, and he has his Ph.D. in physics from UC San Diego, and was a postdoc researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So as the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, he leads 17 departments in 7 interdisciplinary programs in the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. So that is our Dr. Dominguez here. Hopping 2 over here, we have Peter Ulrichsen, and he is assistant professor of mathematics here at Catholic University, and he studies algebraic topology and mathematical formulations of quantum field theory, and he received his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. So Dr. Ulrich is here. We have Dr. Brandon Vaidyanathan. That was good. I'm proud of myself. He is an associate professor and chair in the Department of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. He was born in Qatar and spent his childhood in India. He holds a business administration degree from St. Francis Xavier University and a PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. His research, we love Notre Dame, okay. His research examines organizational cultures in commercial, religious, medical, and scientific institutions. So Dr. Vaidyanathan. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Catherine Pekalik. She is an assistant professor of social research and economic thought at the Tim and Stephanie Bush School of Business here at the Catholic University of America. Her primary areas of research include economics of education and religion, family studies, and Catholic social thought. She lives here in Maryland with her husband Michael and their 8 children. So they'll each take turns. They'll have a few minutes just to kind of share their response to that question, is religion opposed to science? And then following that, be thinking of questions that you maybe want to ask these 4 experts in this field, because you'll have a chance to do that once they're finished. So
I'll go ahead and start. Thank you, Sister. Thank you for chairing this panel and for inviting us here, and thanks to the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. for hosting this beautiful event. And welcome to our campus, to Catholic University of America. Who's this? Is this their first time coming to Catholic University's campus? So maybe half of you, right? So we have some students in the back along the wall. They're Catholic University of America students now, and they can answer any questions you might have about our academic programs. It's a comprehensive research university that's faithfully Catholic. And it's right here in the heart of Washington, D.C., at this beautiful green campus with a metro stop that can take you right into the heart of the nation's capital. It's a residential campus. You get to live on campus, and it's just a wonderful, faith-filled experience. And I'm fortunate to be here. I'm relatively new. I came here about 2 years ago. I've been a scientist, wanted to be a scientist my whole entire life since I was a little boy. I've always known that I wanted to be a scientist. I didn't know when I was 5 years old the difference between a physicist and a chemist or a mathematician, but I knew I wanted to study science. And so that's marked my whole career, my whole path, is the pursuit of fundamental understanding of the natural world. My whole life has also been marked by my faith journey as a Catholic boy, born and raised in the church and in the faith. And that's always been a strong part of my life. And these two things have never been in conflict internally. This is not something I ever experienced in my life. It never occurred to me that there would be some kind of conflict between the pursuit of truth as a scientist and as a Catholic boy and now a Catholic man and now a professor at a university. But in fact, it is kind of the dominant view that's being sold to us out there in the world, that there is this conflict. And in fact, it's an artificial conflict that I think makes you lesser of a scientist if you buy into that. And I think we'll hear quite a bit more about that from my colleagues. Let me just tell you a little bit about the work that we do. So what we use is this gigantic collider, the largest machine ever built by man, the Large Hadron Collider, to accelerate protons in opposite directions and collide them together at energies that represent the early universe, a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. So a trillionth of a second after God created the whole universe, we're able to study the dynamics, the building blocks of matter, and how you put them together. And by studying these fundamental constituents and rules for nature, it helps us understand the profound consequences of these laws of physics and these natural constants, and how we ended up here today with the universe as it is now, with me and you being made of the remnants of supernovas that have self-awareness, and we're having this conversation today. I mean, it's so profound and so beautiful that it seems impossible to be true. And yet it is. And here we are, filled with joy and love. So it's just one of the most beautiful things as a scientist to see that creation from both sides. To see it as a scientist, I'm continually filled with awe and wonder, and that I can build these super fast digital cameras that can image this radiation and build a three-dimensional movie out of these explosions and recreate what happened and discover this thing called the Higgs boson, which is responsible for giving mass to all the other particles. Without this Higgs boson, all of the other particles, according to our theories, would be massless, and so there'd be no mass generated for the other particles, and so they'd be traveling at the speed of light. That's what Einstein's special relativity tells us. So the stuff that we're made of would be all traveling at the speed of light, and we wouldn't coalesce, and there wouldn't be any stars, there wouldn't be there would be no universe as we know it without this Higgs boson. And we were able to uncover this and discover this in our experiments, and see how it has such a profound impact on the evolution of the entire universe. To see that both from with one eye of science and the other eye of faith, I think I have a more complete, at least more compelling and satisfactory view of the world by opening my eyes to both of these types of truth. So for me, there's no conflict between faith and science, and I have many friends who are not Christians, who are not believers, some of whom are even atheists, and we all work together on this machine because we have this common pursuit that we've agreed to work together on peacefully. I think probably one of the greatest achievements of this Large Hadron Collider project is that it required the cooperation of 10,000 scientists from around the world, and we've done it voluntarily and peacefully. There's nobody forcing us to do this, and that we've done this together. And we could never have done it. One man could never do such a thing. It would take a single person 10,000 years to carry out this endeavor. So it literally required the peaceful cooperation of scientific colleagues from around the world. And let me tell you, working with these guys is not easy because every one of them thinks they're the smartest guy in the world because they sort of are. And so that, I think, shows a beautiful aspect of our own humanity that God has given us, that we have that capacity to do these great things together. And as a man of faith, I can see the hand of God at work in this. So for me, I just love doing this. This is my dream job in every respect, and that now I'm here at a a profoundly Catholic university that takes these two things seriously and integrates them into everything that we do is kind of the fulfillment, I think, of my whole entire career at this point. So I'm so happy that you're here. I'm looking forward to talking to you today. And so I'll pass on the mic, and thank you very much.
Good morning. Good afternoon. So I'm not the only social. I'm used to being the only social scientist, but today I'm not, which is great. But as the economist on the panel, I thought I would start with Adam Smith. I think that's sort of a thing I should do, right? Oh, good. 3 cheers for Adam Smith. Okay. So Adam Smith. So you probably don't know about some of the inner debates, right? I mean, every science has its own debates about what it is and what it isn't, right? So Adam Smith is not only as an economist, but he's great for having advanced the idea and continuing to defend the idea that economic science is a science. And he meant it in that way as a science, as opposed to something we now call constructivism in the social sciences, at least. So he said, well, the constructivist, is to construct. So constructivists, like engineers, think about trying to construct reality according to things that they might think are good or interesting, maybe possible, maybe not possible. But for Adam Smith, he thought, well, the posture of the scientist is actually just to try to understand, right? So to observe, to look for patterns, and to understand before beginning to build, right, or beginning to construct. And some sciences, more than others, lend themselves to things that we can then use to build things, but the beginning is to try to understand. So Adam Smith wrote a lecture on astronomy. You may not know this, right? Yeah, he was a kind of polymath, an early polymath, I think. And so here's what he said about science in general in his essay on astronomy. He said, so I'm quoting now from Adam Smith. He said, wonder, the sentiment, the feeling of wonder and surprise and admiration. He said, these are words that in English are often confounded. We kind of put them together as if they're all the same thing. But he said, we should not make that mistake. He said, they're different from one another. He said, what is new and singular excites this feeling or sentiment of wonder. We wonder at something. And what is unexpected gives us surprise. And what is great or beautiful brings us to admiration. We admire. And so he went on to say, we wonder at all extraordinary and uncommon objects, at the rarer phenomena of nature. So at meteors and comets and eclipses, at singular plants and animals, right? And at everything, in short, with which we have before been either little or not at all acquainted, and we still wonder, even when forewarned, of what we are to see. So, for instance, last week we enjoyed a lunar eclipse here, and my boys got up at midnight to go out and see it, and the moon was also red, right? It was kind of blood moon, and shame on me, I said to my husband, well, the boys don't have to get up, there'll be another one soon, right? And he said, no, my friend informs me that now we're in a phase where it will be maybe a decade before another lunar eclipse. I thought, it's remarkable that these things come in waves sometimes, and then I don't understand these things. But the point is, although we knew we were going to see a lunar eclipse, you still go out and you just think, wow, that's amazing. So you may be forewarned, but you still wonder. And then Smith went on, he said, we are surprised at those things which we have seen often, perhaps, but which we least of all expected to meet with in a particular place where we find them. So seeing a friend at an unexpected place. And then the last thing he talked about was admiration. He said, we admire the beauty of a plain or the greatness of a mountain, even though we have seen both often before, and nothing appears to us in either new. Like if we have a view of the mountain or of the sea, every day we get up, we see the same mountain, and yet we still marvel at its beauty, right? And so this is very interesting. Now, I said that Smith defended the idea that economics was a science, and he believed that the posture of the scientist in astronomy, as much as in economics, was to help us move from the sentiments of surprise and wonder. We say, wow, why should it be that way? Why should that appear in that place? to admiration. So when we see a mountain, it's self-evident, as it were, or a sunset. It's self-evident that it's beautiful. But the role of the scientist is to help us uncover the hidden beauty behind an effect that we didn't understand as being caused by something beautiful, right? So for many of us, not all of us, there's the economists in some ways, and certainly the physicists, we uncover certain principles or patterns which we can put into mathematical terms, which are often very beautiful. But until that process of discovery, we didn't know there was a principle behind the effect that we saw, which was beautiful. And so that would be the role of the scientist, to help make more beautiful, help us see as more beautiful things which prior to that merely seemed a kind of coincidence of nature. We didn't understand that something beautiful was behind it. And so many, I expect Brandon will help us with this, many scientists do say that the motive for them is to uncover these beautiful things, right? So that's, and of course for Smith, for his works on economics, one of the things that he began with was this sort of surprise. He said, well, isn't it surprising that some nations should be wealthy and others should be poor? And what causes that? Are there ways we can understand the growth in wealth? Because surely we should wish for that for people. So how can we understand this? Why are some nations wealthy, right? So what are the causes of wealth? So I wanted to just touch on faith then briefly. And when I was thinking about Smith's comments on surprise and how surprise is helpful for science, I was thinking about how Pope Francis at last Easter talked about our faith as being a faith of surprises and how much that's important for faith. So Pope Francis said on Easter last year, he said, God does not know how to announce something to us without surprising us. It's like a really interesting way of putting it, right? That God speaks to us through surprises and, of course, through nature in the same way. So Francis said, the surprise is what stirs the heart, what touches you precisely there. You're not expecting it, and that's how God speaks. So this kind of habit of mind of faith that we have of expecting surprises, of understanding that God speaks in kind of a mysterious way, right? A surprise is actually is something that can be mysterious, right? When you encounter a surprise, gee, why? The mystery is what brings us to the wonder, the question. Why is it so? And then we sort of seek for an answer. So Pope Francis goes on to say back Easter, he said, after the surprise, we want to kind of hurry. It's a kind of haste, the good news of the gospel. So he talks about that. So it's easy to see then that like the way that there's not a conflict between faith and science is that the habits and the postures which are natural for people of faith to understand that there's this like language of mystery and beauty in nature that we can approach, that's a habit of the mind that we become very used to in religion and in faith. And so it can assist us in our science. And this is what Smith thought very much. So I hope we can discuss that a little bit.
Thank you. It's good to be here today. The question for our panel is asking about religion and science. And I'd just like to make a clarification. I want to speak specifically about the Catholic faith. I'm narrowing the question slightly. So the question I want to consider is, are the Catholic faith and science opposed to each other? I realize that not all participants today are Catholic, but that's the restriction I want to make. And so I have three answers to this question. Absolutely not, sometimes, and certainly. So first of all, the Catholic faith and science are certainly not opposed, and we've heard this from our first two panelists. Each of these is a way of seeking to obtain true knowledge about the world and about ourselves. Truth and truth will not be in conflict, and so attempts to arrive at truth have to be compatible. This makes sense, and it's something that the Church has taught formally. So here's a quotation. Between faith and reason, no true dissension can ever exist, since the same God, who reveals mysteries and infuses faith, has bestowed on the human soul the light of reason. That's a quotation from the First Vatican Council in 1870, about 150 years ago. And that council itself is referring to a document from a council in the 1500s, the Fifth Lateran Council. So this is not a new question, and it's a question where the Church has been very consistent and clear that there's a compatibility here, as we've heard discussed. So summing things up, truth can't conflict with truth, so there's certainly not such opposition. My next answer to the question, though, is sometimes. And in this case, I want to speak of the Catholic faith and science, empirical science, as being social, cultural, and historic institutions. There have been points of contention between the Church, whether members or the hierarchy itself, and scientists. I think Dr. Vaidyanathan is going to talk to us a little more about specific views of scientists today, and that'll be a great compliment. I don't want to consider particular cases. Galileo is one especially that comes to mind. I just want to note that sometimes there has been opposition when we think of science and the Catholic faith in terms of groups of people. And we want to have a sober view and say, yes, this has been a challenge at times. So the second answer, sometimes. But now to the third sense. In this case, I want to say, yes, there is opposition. But before we go into the details, let's study the words we use a bit more closely. Opposition can mean to be antagonistic to or hostile to, and that's not the sense of the word that I want to consider. It can also mean to present or consider by way of contrast or balance. More tangibly, our thumbs can be referred to as opposable. That's saying that it's set apart from or facing our fingers. And so there's a milder sense here, that the things can be distinguished, set apart from each other, contrasted. And in this sense, yes, there is opposition between the Catholic faith and empirical sciences. So here are a handful of key features that I see of the natural sciences. Science seeks generality. We want to describe a broad range of phenomena in galaxies, atoms, proteins, plants, animals, humans. Let's not forget fungi. Under a few general, simple principles. One of the great delights of science, and I was just talking with Dr. Pekolik about an example in mathematics before we got up here, Lagrange's theorem, is that seemingly unrelated things can have a common explanation. And that's that generality that's proper to the sciences. And next, science arrives at a kind of certainty. Now I ask you to grant me a mathematical digression. Mathematics has a really special kind of certainty. We fix some first principles, and we proceed from them by deduction. The things that we deduce follow necessarily from whatever we started with, and so there's just an absolute certainty in mathematics. This is special about mathematics. Sciences such as chemistry or physics, you'll have to pardon me, don't proceed in quite the same way. Although they adopt the language of mathematics, they don't adopt that same certainty of mathematics because they don't have the same sense of fixed first principles and simply the process of deduction. Now, I don't want to deny that the empirical sciences have a kind of certainty. I'm not about to go jump off a building because I doubt conclusions about gravity and Newton's account thereof. I just want to emphasize that the certainty that we have in physical science, it has a provisional character. The conclusions stand to be refined or at times even replaced, but they are giving us true knowledge about real things. One final remark. Science is dealing with things that are accessible to our senses, either directly or indirectly by means of equipment, like the particle colliders that Dean Dominguez helps build, or the telescopes that Smith was using and considering in astronomy. It has to do with tangible stuff. So the key features of sciences were generality, this provisional certainty, and the tangibility of its objects. So now I want to oppose, in the milder sense of set at a contrast, the Catholic faith and science under these three aspects. Until just a couple weeks ago, if you went to a church, you would see a nativity scene, a little Jesus there in the manger, Mary and Joseph, some animals, shepherds. And why do we do this? We do this because we want to keep in mind something that's really shocking. God came to a specific place at a specific time and lived a single, humble human life. And there's just one of them. That just happened one time. There was some specific donkey that looked at him. And so there's no kind of generality here. This is just a shocking, single event, once in the whole history of the world, of the universe. And so the Catholic faith is really rooted in this truth, this singular event, and not just a general notion of God's presence in the world, but rather his presence right there. So second, on the theme of certainty, the Catholic faith is absolutely certain. It's so because its source is God himself. God came, he taught his apostles, and they've handed on a teaching. It's fixed, it's certain. When we profess our faith in the creed, we're affirming this, and this is something that martyrs die for. Finally, in contrast to the tangible objects that we consider in empirical science, faith has as its object God himself. It's easy to lose track of this, but it's an immense gift. God has no need of us, but he's chosen to tell us about himself, about who he is. It's totally beyond any natural capacity that we have. I'm capable of seeing and touching things, but there's nothing in me that makes me in any way proportional to God in his essence. And yet that knowledge is what he has given us. Soon, you guys are going to have the chance to go to Mass, and one of the things that you'll do there is to recite the Creed. As you do so, I hope that you'll reflect on its content. The things we profess in the Creed aren't simply about living an ethical life or geometric truths or how stars work. They're about God himself, about who he is. We must cherish this creed, which gives us personal knowledge of God, which is beyond any natural capacity of ours. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was beautiful. Thanks all. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me, whoever decided to do that. All right, so I'm a sociologist. I teach here at Catholic U, and so I want to talk today about three things. First, what is sociology? Why is it a science? And what can it tell us about this science-religion conflict that we're talking about? How many of you have heard of sociology? Like that? All right, so maybe half of you. All right, there are a lot of popular misconceptions about what it is, right? So is sociology social work? No. Social work is a very important and noble profession, but they help people, we don't, right? So that's one. Is a sociologist a socialist? Not necessarily, though one of the founding fathers of the field came up with the concept, but not necessarily. Is a sociologist a sociopath? That I'll leave up to you to decide, so if you meet a few of them. No, a sociologist is someone who studies how the social world works. Okay, so what are the causes and workings of the social dimension of reality? And sociologists are social scientists in the sense that we use the scientific method to study people empirically, right, through surveys, experiments, interviews, participant observation, and other methods. And then we develop and test theories, just like how natural scientists do, but theories about how the social world works. Okay, in the same way that a physicist or biologist might study how atoms or genes work, right? So that's the scientific method applied to the study of the social world. So how is sociology relevant to this question of is religion opposed to science? So I want to address this in a couple of ways. One, looking at the history of sociology, and second, applying the tools of sociology. So the idea that religion is opposed to science actually lies at the origin of sociology as a discipline. Okay, so the main founding father of sociology, a French chap called Auguste Comte, an intellectual with a very serious case of physics envy, wanted to create a social physics. I mean, that's really what he wanted to do, a scientific way of studying the social world in the same way that physicists of the time studied the laws of nature. He envisioned society as evolving from some kind of primitive phase, and that's the religious phase, to an enlightened scientific phase. You move from religion to science. You cast one behind and you move forward to the other. And in this new evolved society, sociologists would be the new high priests. That's actual quotation from Kant. Many sociologists have been skeptical towards religion, okay, if not hostile. Many prominent sociologists have tried to explain religion by reducing it to some social factor. For instance, a means for elite social classes to control the poor and prevent them from revolting, right? You appease them with religion and so on. They've also attempted to come up with various kinds of scientific explanations for religion, again, reducing it to some kind of social need or some kind of illusion. And sociologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries made a lot of scientific predictions about the fate of religion, mainly that religion would disappear with modernization. They turned out to be wrong. However, at the same time, many sociologists of the past have also been people of profound religious commitment, often clergy, with deep commitments to social justice. So our sociology department here at Catholic U in its early years was led by priests who integrated theology and sociology. One of them, for instance, Father Furphy, played a crucial role in the Catholic worker movement. In Europe, a number of papal encyclicals have been informed by the work of sociologists who studied, for instance, the experiences of factory workers, the injustices and alienation they suffered. And this sort of empirical understanding contributed to the Church's teachings, for instance, on the rights to unionization. So sociologists can do good social science without buying into the silly assumptions about religion that are baked into the foundings of the discipline. Like all science, sociology is also about the pursuit of truth, right? The truth about how the social level of reality really works. So it's really crucial to understand, for instance, that we're not just individuals, we're not just little atomic individuals, but our interactions as persons produce higher order social structures. So for example, like hydrogen and oxygen interact to produce water, right? That's a higher level entity. It's got unique powers and properties that you can't reduce to the powers and properties of hydrogen and oxygen. So similarly, our social structures, like families, neighborhoods, religious institutions, markets, governments, and so on, emerge out of the interaction of human persons. They depend on human persons. They don't just exist out there like some kind of ghost, right? But they still do operate at a kind of sort of independent level. They operate at a higher level. They influence us. They enable us to act in certain ways and constrain us from acting in others. That's why I can't do a backflip out here, because the norms of this context constrain me, other than the fact that I'm not capable of doing a backflip, but that's just biology. So, anyway, if you want to, understand and solve social problems, you have to understand how social structures operate and how they exert causal powers. And this is really crucial to consider even in theology. So when St. John Paul II talks about structures of sin, he's talking about social structures that perpetuate evil and prevent the flourishing of persons. So sociology contributes to understanding how that happens. So I myself am a convert to Catholicism. I entered the church 20 years ago, almost to this date, January 29th. And I used to think that religion, thank you, praise God. I used to think that religion was just a social construct, something to appease primitive minds. And after I became a Catholic, I went to university and started to encounter sociology. And initially I thought it was just some sort of anti-religious propaganda. But eventually, as I started to realize, in trying to make sense of the world, that you can't make sense of human behavior simply at the individual level. There are truths about how the social world works. I was drawn into studying that, okay? Because faith, for me, led me to the pursuit of truth. If you discover who Jesus is and you discover that he is the truth, then you realize you're loved by the truth, and you discover that you should fall in love with the truth as well. And so, loving the truth more than your own opinions is a crucial characteristic of, I think, a good scientist, right? So I was led to study sociology, and one of the things I came to study as a sociologist is occupations like scientists. So I've been studying for the last few years what scientists in different countries really think about religion. So why do we need to do that? In part because we hear so often these loud voices of the new atheists and others who claim that science is opposed to religion and that you can't be a good scientist if you're a person of faith. Then you also hear, on the other hand, good folks like Dean Dominguez, Dr. Ulrichsen, who are scientists who are deeply committed to the Catholic faith, but do most natural scientists believe that? Where do they fit, right? So how many scientists in the United States are like Dean Dominguez? How many physicists fit that kind of profile? And how many would be closer to someone like, say, Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, right? Those are empirical questions. And so I set out with a number of colleagues to survey 10,000 physicists and biologists in 8 different countries, and we found a number of interesting things. First, most scientists do tend to be less religious than the general publics of their countries. That is an empirical fact, on various measures of religiosity. But this is not universally the case. In some countries like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and India, scientists are more religious than the public on these various measures. So that's a surprise. That doesn't fit with this dominant conception of conflict. Secondly, most atheist scientists did not become less religious because of science. We found in our surveys that less than 10% of them said they did. So most of them, who are non-religious, grew up in non-religious families or were exposed to, let's say, bad religion, the kind that prevents questioning and inquiry about reality. So when they wanted to understand the world, their institutions, their communities did not encourage that. They tried to squelch it. That's not a property of their faith. That's a property of just bad communities or bad education. Thirdly, when we ask scientists around the world whether they believe that science and religion are in conflict, right? So this is the question that we're discussing here. What do scientists believe about that question? In every single country, the majority of them said no. The majority in each country sees science and religion as independent. They are different realms of inquiry. So perhaps oppositional in that second sense that Dr. Ulrichsen mentioned, right? So they're getting at different aspects of reality. Nearly 1/4 of scientists see science and religion as being compatible. They can inform and help each other. Less than 1/3 of scientists see religion and science as being in conflict. And even when we talked to some of those scientists, we surveyed 10,000 and then we interviewed about 600 of them. And when we asked them in interviews where they see the conflict, we find that it depends on what you mean by science and religion. So if you mean a kind of scientific materialism where nothing exists other than what can be measured using the scientific method, and if you mean by religion a kind of scriptural fundamentalism, then yeah, they're in conflict. But these are not how most scientists understand either science or religion. So hopefully you can see how sociology, in spite of its problematic beginnings, can contribute to dispelling the myth of the science-religion conflict. Thank you.
All right. I learned a lot. Not only big words that I didn't know before, but other interesting things. So I think what this kind of showed me and hopefully showed you is that this gift of intellect that God has given us is to be used for his glory, but in so many ways that maybe people in the pew might not think of initially. But I think these are 4 great examples of ways that we can employ our reason to really study God's creation in different levels. In philosophy, we talk about science as that knowledge of those sure signs or principles that can be followed by anyone. And I think that's why we can have, maybe some people would think of science as maybe the harder sciences like biology, physics, but as we can see, it includes things such as economics and sociology. And I think that's important for us to realize as well. So does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists before we continue the conversation? Anything? Okay, how about something like in kind of dialoguing with people who maybe aren't religious in any capacity in your fields, is there any vocabulary to avoid or maybe to take on as people of faith in order to kind of facilitate a more healthy dialogue?
Well, I mean, it really depends on who they are. I think the best conversations you can have are with your friends. You can be friendly. You can have a brothership, with another person, and share some form of brotherly love with each other and respect. And I think that's the foundation of all of these discussions, is that you have to find that common humanity, that friendship, that true friendship. Like I said, I have friends who are atheists. I have friends who are Buddhists. I have, friends who are not Catholics but are other kinds of Christians, and I love them, and they're my friends, and we help each other out, watch each other's kids and do things together, right? But that's the foundation, is that shared humanity, and then from that, then you start building from this foundation of trust and mutual love. So for me, that's how it works best. It works the worst if it's a confrontation and somebody I don't know, and it's a hostile interaction. It's very hard then to break through that to these kind of profound personal issues around faith. So that's what I would suggest, is to go out and make friends, and when you have that type of love, you're not going to be driving your friend away when you talk about faith. You tell them about your own faith. You say, this is what it means to me, and this is how I struggled to get there, and this is my story. And they can see that in themselves too. So that's what I would do. And to avoid doing this after you've had something to drink, or or haven't had enough sleep, or some debilitated in some other way, that's not good.
I think something small to add, which may be difficult to add in a small way, but I'm going to try to add in a small way. So a friend with whom I now work closely on some projects, but I didn't know him before we started to speak about some research projects. And we actually share a faith, but it was interesting that in our first conversation, he asked me this question. He said, "What would you do if?" Because in the social sciences, you always have hypotheses, but in the social sciences, because we think about people, and because our faith tells us a lot about people and how we perhaps ought to live, so he asked me, "What would you do if your research pointed you in a direction that seemed in conflict with something that the church tells us about people?" And that's sort of, I think that's a good thing to, whether or not we're talking with people we agree with about faith or don't agree with about faith. I find that if my colleagues understand that I have an honest search for truth, that I'm not, because that there's 1,000 ways in which you can think that your research should say X, and that X would be consistent with your faith, but because we are not in the social sciences dealing with the mode of certitude that Dr. Ulrichsen talked about, there are ways we can mismeasure things, we can think what's true might be measured in some way, but in fact it's not. And so this particular friend now, with whom we do a lot of work together, but he wanted to know, what's your position on that? Are you doing this in a kind of an honest way, or are you kind of really just looking for one answer? And I think that distinguishes kind of the scientific posture from maybe more of I won't say religious posture, but something like an evangelism, or something we like to use the word bias, which I think is overused and misunderstood. But yeah, that I find that with colleagues in general, if we respect each other's honest search for truth and willingness to understand that we can't always expect our science to show us what we thought it would show us. That works very well, and it's important.
Something that came to mind with your question is that we have to simultaneously hold both that what we affirm with the theological virtue of faith is reasonable. What we affirm with faith is reasonable, but it's not something that we've just arrived at by the power of our reason. This is, to have faith, the theological virtue, is a gift. And it's not totally distinct from what we're doing with reason, but it's also, so we can give reasons, but that's not all it is. It's not something we've acquired of ourselves.
I guess one of the things I would add is I've many colleagues, many sociologist colleagues whom I find very admirable because of their commitment to justice. It's something that growing up I never really had, and I've seen some people who from a very young age have been committed to serving others in ways that for me seem, wow, I would really have to endure a lot of emotional angst to, overcome my selfishness in these ways. But sociology as a discipline has embedded these value commitments about why inequality is such a problem, about why oppression and domination of various kinds are bad, and it's admirable to see people committing their lives and their energy to this, and I'm often humbled by this, and I want to learn from these people. What is it that gives you this conviction? And people who are not people of faith, right? So where does this come from? Where do you find the good, and why is it good? What makes it good? What makes it worth pursuing? And in part, those conversations have helped strengthen my own faith, to help me understand aspects of my faith that I guess have been weak, and virtues that I need to cultivate, and so forth. So that's the other side of the coin there.
Any question? Okay, we have one question. We have wonderful volunteers who will bring you a microphone.
Hi, thank you all for speaking. This is wonderful. So obviously here at Catholic U, I'm a student here, we have more of a gentle environment when it comes to this discussion between religion and science. It's typically not like a harsh, aggressive sort of conversation. But especially in other fields like biology, which none of you are, typically this can be a pretty heated conversation, and people can kind of get squared out because of their faith, and it has become a very aggressive field. How do you respond to things like that? And especially in things like women's health, where Catholics actually do have a lot of science on our side, how do we address those people, and how have you faced that in your own careers, that sort of aggression towards the faith?
Yeah, I think one of the things that drew me here to Catholic University was precisely what you mentioned, that you feel more comfortable here, discussing these big questions. And in fact, we have more freedom as academics, as researchers, as physicists and biologists at an authentically Catholic university like this to discuss these big questions than you do in the secular universities. So that's one thing, that we're lucky that we have that, and we should preserve that and build it up. And even more so, though, we have, I think, an obligation to speak the truth about these things. And as a research university, we have a privileged position to do that because we have world-class scientists who study these things, and we should be resolute and forceful, but polite, and in letting the world know what we've discovered about biology. And so I think we kind of have to take that cross and bear it. That one of the very first things I did when I came to Catholic University was to co-author a letter to the National Institutes of Health, because they wanted to change the rules on doing research with model organisms called chimeras, human-animal chimeras. It's the mixture between an animal and human DNA to create a new creature. And so that was forbidden, and then the Obama administration relaxed it. And so we at Catholic University wrote a letter outlining why, what are the boundaries that we should cross and shouldn't cross, and why, by respecting the integrity and identity of animals and the inherent dignity of human beings. How, even if you want to use these creatures and by creating and destroying human beings to do good, to try to solve human diseases, you're doing it from this inherently evil act. And so we can help inform research for the entire world with this foundation that we have from our Catholic faith. So it's hard because we're in the minority on these biological issues in particular. But if you want to seek a career in biology or in science, I would encourage you to keep doing that, and that you have allies. You have people like me and others here at Catholic University who are trying to build this place into a world-class enterprise that faces these issues.
I think that's really great. I wanted to just sort of build on that a little tiny bit and say that one of the reasons I went into science, I think, was misguided. So let me explain that. So I was as a young person, my father was a pretty committed pro-life activist, and I was moved by the problems related to, we can say women's health, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I was moved by all of these sorts of problems that lead to the tragedy of abortion, and of course the tragedy itself, and then its consequences. And so many things related to that. And I thought that I actually thought that, well, okay, so there are scientific things we can learn that can help us with these sorts of debates. And I've come to view that a little bit differently. I think the science can help, but the kinds of things you're speaking about, these kind of, what seem like social shouting matches about women's health, for instance, they're not really fueled by science, are they? Right? So science can't tell us how to think about or define women's health. So oftentimes, it's, I think, a way to, you really ask a question about how to handle the thing itself, and I think one of the things we can do as people of faith is to sort of, by example, exhibit calmness and rationality. Right? So this isn't really about, science is on our side. I don't want to spend a lot of time insisting, yes it is, no it isn't, yes it is, no it isn't. But actually just to kind of recognize, look, that there are really interesting personal and social narratives by which people make sense out of the few things we know from science. And I say few because, in fact, up till now, we can't enlighten everything with and what in the areas of social science, at least related to women's health, which I know more about and recently published on. We actually we can't get at all the things we'd like to get at. But then we recognize, all right, look, this public discussion, so then how can we contribute as people of faith to, well, how do we think about women's health? I remember someone asking me when I was pregnant with my third child, do you think that's healthy for you? Right? Do you think that third baby is healthy? No, it really depends how you define health. If you want to think about the quality of the veins in my legs, the third baby was not healthy for me, right? So, but then of course this opens up a really fascinating conversation. What is health, and how do we think about it? And now we're in a place that isn't science anymore. It's really a kind of humane inquiry. And we can play a great role there, but when we enter that, because we don't go in with a kind of frenzied attitude about like throwing the books of science at each other, I've got my preferred study and you have yours, we can maybe start that conversation in a way that's sort of more humane, maybe, and not as scary, because there's nothing to be scared about, right?
Hello. Hi. I want to ask a question. Can science prove God's existence?
Who wants to take that one?
I don't have much to say on that, but I don't think science can prove God's non-existence. Yeah.
I mean, one of the quotation I made was from the First Vatican Council, and there's a statement there, which is that we're capable of knowing, using reason, that God exists. So this is part of our Catholic faith. And so we can be confident in that. Science there would need to be this kind of broader sense that Sister Maria Juan alluded to, rather than just empirical science regarding tangible things, but more knowledge of causes. But the fact is, reason alone, unaided, makes progress sometimes only with difficulty and is prone to error. So grace is especially helpful. But reason is capable of knowing that a first principle of all that is exists. That's part of our faith.
Yeah, it's part of our philosophy classes too. So
Metaphysics,
yes.
the highest
Yeah.
science.
That's why we're here. I want to expand my cheeky response, which is, I think it's still true, but it's something that we say a lot, or we worry a lot about in social science, but I assume in the physical sciences too, which is that there's a difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence, right? So we lack evidence or proof of a particular thing is not the same as saying that there's no proof possible. And sometimes even scientists mix this up, right? So they say, well, I didn't see an effect in this population, therefore the effect doesn't exist. You say, well, no, you just don't have evidence of that particular thing. So this is an important principle. So it may not be for science to do this proof in particular.
A couple of things I might add. One is, again, it depends on what you mean by God, right? Because if science is in the business of trying to understand the natural world and things that have being, in sort of the created order, God isn't just one among, it's like a one massive mega entity, right, among other entities, right? So if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, then you could figure out some kind of macroscope of sorts to try and test this entity with. And that seems like attempts to prove God's existence using science or, disprove it or that kind of thing, right? You're saying, look, I'm using these methods that I use to test everyday objects, and this massive mega object isn't responding, so it's not there. And that seems to be the kind of endeavor. And so if God is not part of nature, you can't use that method, right? So that's one challenge there. The other thing, I just recently was reading something, and my mind is like a sieve, unfortunately, so you have to excuse me. It was a woman who was consulted in the cause of the canonization of, I think, Marguerite Duvel, St. Marguerite Duvel. She was a medical doctor who was an atheist, and she wrote a book recently because I think after this, she was surprised that she was invited by the Vatican to examine these miracles, and she basically said this is a miracle because there's no scientific account that we can give for how this happened. This violates everything we know about how nature works, right? And then she systematically inquired into the various causes of canonization of various saints, and again was consistently able to say, yeah, there are a bunch of miracles. I'm still an atheist. I don't believe in God, but something's happening here, right? So science can tell you that, okay, this is this is a miracle or this isn't. Here are the natural workings of the world, and then it's up to us to use our reason to infer and say, well, what is the cause, right? And so that might be another way in which this could interact.
All right, Father, you had a question.
All right, so I have a comment and also a question. The first is I'd like to make the comment. My mother had me, and I was deaf as I was growing up. And our neighbor, she herself was a nurse. She asked my mother, soon in the future, technology is going to be available to have So technology is advancing so that children who are deaf or blind or for whatever reason, technology can discover that, and you would be then able to abort a child that has a disability. So my mother looked at this woman and said, look, my child's deaf. This is what God gave me, and this is what I have. It's not for me to decide. And I thought that was a really interesting story, that the nurse was looking at a disabled child and the ability to abort and scientific advances, and missing the presence of God in all things and having science and faith together. So if my mother had aborted me, I wouldn't be here today. And to me, that's just kind of an odd perception for someone else. And just to let you know, my name is Father Sean Carey. I'm one of a few Catholic priests in the United States, and I'm from Boston. And so I guess my question for you, are you familiar St. Thomas Aquinas, his theory about the first mover? Are you guys familiar? Just curious. And if you would comment on that.
The question was if I'm familiar, and only slightly, but I understand it to be that as soon as there was evidence of human life that was recognized as human life, it's just that now we're able earlier to recognize that presence, whereas when you just had the ability to, say, feel, that was a later thing than conception itself.
Yeah, does Father just want to know if we're familiar with the Thomist reasoning? Yes, so like the unmoved mover or the first cause. Yeah, you can use reason, which is what Aquinas did and Aristotle before him. Just with pure reason, you can, without invoking faith, you can reason yourself back to the existence of a prime mover, or somebody who has the characteristics of what we consider to be God. And you can do that with unaided reason alone in various ways. There's like 5 classical different arguments to get your way back there through the concept of change or hierarchies. And there's if you take a philosophy class here at Catholic University, you'll get to know about all of this great stuff. But yeah, your personal story is very moving, Father. And I think we're privileged to have you here in our church to minister to our deaf community. So thank you for what you do.
Father's actually on our panel this afternoon, so if you would like to hear more about his story, come back then. It's a commercial for that. So, any other questions here? Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering how your studies in your respective fields and studies of science have kind of affected your personal faith life and development in your relationship with Christ through those studies.
Well, for me personally, my scientific work enhances my faith, and vice versa. When I talked briefly about the kind of physics we do, the profound nature of the discoveries that we make, I see the fingerprints of God everywhere when I uncover these things. Even when I'm teaching undergraduate physics classes, I see beauty in creation, and I see God at work. I mean, so I'm a physics professor. I have to do a demonstration. So there's this concept of symmetries of nature leading to conservation laws in physics, and it goes by the name of Nether's theorem. It's a mathematical theorem outside of physics, but it has a deep implication on how the universe is put together. So here's my iPhone. It's the same iPhone here as it is over here, so it's invariant under the symmetry of translation. Right? So it's symmetric under this transformation of translation. So I take it from here into here. It's the same iPhone. That symmetry of translation leads to the conservation of momentum. So now we've understood something profound about how the mechanics of the universe works. Because the phone is the same here as it is over here, momentum is conserved. If I set my phone here and let it sit there for 10 seconds, 10 seconds later it's the same. So it's invariant under the transformation of time. So it's the same here as it is in 10 seconds. That symmetry under time transformation leads to the conservation of energy. So now we've understood something about the nature of the whole entire universe from this beautiful symmetry. And it's intelligible and beautiful and profound, and it has the fingerprints of God all over it. It's the phone, if it's the same here as it is over here, it's invariant under rotation. That leads to the conservation of angular momentum. So this just goes on and on. And for me, it enhances my faith, and I feel sorry for my friends and colleagues who are atheists, because I think they have to work much harder as people to avoid seeing God everywhere. They really have to close their eyes. And I think it takes a lot more work. They must expend much more personal energy to avoid the obvious presence of God everywhere.
Maybe I can say something small about, which maybe helps to explain what I said before about when I was young and how misguided I was about science, maybe. But so for me, one of the reasons, I knew I loved science. I wanted to go into science, but before I discovered the social sciences, I was certainly thinking about the natural sciences. I took lots and lots of courses in chemistry and math and physics and biology, and only then, after all of that, discovered that what I was really interested in was social science. But one of the reasons I was interested in science at all was because I wanted to help people, and I just thought, well, I don't know, you're young and you think, well, we should make everything better, right? That's And that's not misguided. That's a really good thing, and it's something that you young people have much more than we do now at our ages. And you should hang on to that. But many of my professors actually said that attitude to want to make things better was not a good attitude to have when you go into science. And I didn't understand that at the time. I thought that was terrible. But then I went on, and I think here's the part about my faith, at least that I've spent the last decade reflecting on more heavily, is that I believed when I was 20 that, again, that sort of science on its own, that if I really sort of found the right study or did the right study, could help things, help the world, help other people, help people to do things better, to live better. And then I realized that science on its own is not persuasive. And it very rarely helps anybody do anything better, actually. And then, of course, I thought, well, gee, what's the point of all this? This is terrible. But this actually led me to think much harder and pray a lot more about what the source of goodness is in the world. And that's what brought me back to thinking, well, gosh, this is what the church has been saying all along, right? That in fact, we don't accomplish or get anywhere good without grace. So I spend a lot more time now, rather than thinking about the perfect study or the perfect, piece of scientific evidence, praying that whatever ridiculous, tiny efforts I might have in my own little science, praying that God could sort of transform that and make it an instrument for something good. Because I've realized that sort of good that I aspired to when I was your age, that was a good thing to aspire to, it's not something I can achieve through intellectual effort on my own. So I've come to see how much, like, in my tiny corner of scientific effort, I just need to try to collaborate with God's work and beg for grace, because all those little aspirations I had for making things better, that's God's work, right? And that is, after getting through a lot of anguish, that was a wonderful place to get to. Because then I didn't think it was like all something I had to do, right? It wasn't like there wasn't like the right committee or the right club or the right, publication. So it's really freeing and wonderful. But it took me a lot of struggle to get there.
A somewhat frightening at times question that I can ask myself is, do I actually want to go to heaven? Can I actually imagine wanting that? And what's the connection of this in mathematics? One of my colleagues who studies algebraic topology as well is in the audience, and he'll know what I mean when I say homology is a functor. This is an algebro-topological statement that encapsulates a whole bunch in just 3 words. And there's this huge development of a beautiful theory that lets you, in just one brief statement, encapsulate a whole bunch of things. And so for me, when I'm studying mathematics, I experience a joy in being able to see many different things in a single cause or in a single principle. And that's an image of what beatitude is, because we're going to see God, who's the cause of these things. So we'll see a more universal or a higher cause all the way to the very top. So for me, the delight of mathematical study is a kind of image for that and can help me strive for that can otherwise seem a little bit distant or abstract.
I guess I'd say 3 things. One is, when I've encountered really good sociological research, that's really shaped my faith in a number of ways. So it's not just how well a study was done, but the insights you gain into how the social world works, and particularly studies about how poverty works, how why people who are in certain neighborhoods remain over generations disadvantaged, right? And that leads me then to realize the suffering and misery of so many people, and why is it that people can't just sort of pick themselves up by their bootstraps? Once you start to understand the social world, you realize how we've all messed up as human beings in the world we've created, and that becomes fodder for prayer. It becomes fodder for begging for mercy for our world. And so, I mean, a book like Evicted by Matthew Desmond is something I would recommend. It's really brilliant work, but opens your eyes to the suffering of people in this country. Another aspect of how my science affects my faith is through the research I do. So I do a lot of qualitative interviews. I've interviewed maybe more than 1,000 people in the last decade, and it's a real privilege in the work I do to talk to people and learn about their lives, and particularly you look to learn about their yearnings for happiness. And so these are not people of faith necessarily that I talk to, but in that attempt to sit with somebody, to be present to them, to understand what they're looking for, their joys and their pains, that's a great privilege. And again, to me, I think that strengthens my faith, just that insight into the beauty of people's lives as well as their sufferings. And again, is something that deepens my relationship with God as I pray for people that I encounter. There are frustrations too. I also study as an ethnographer. That is, I spend time in communities, often religious communities as well as corporations and so on, spending time looking at cultures of these environments. That's hard because I'm supposed to be kind of an observer who doesn't alter the situation too much, and so church politics, for instance, is really awful, and it's horrible to be in some of these situations watching things unfold over months and realizing, wow, we're really a mess. Lord, where are you? I mean, so I don't know if that strengthens my faith, but it does impact it in some way.
Thank you. All right, one more thing.
Just say one more thing. Tonight when you go to Mass in the Basilica, look up in the East Transept, and you'll see a mosaic of creation, of science. You'll see mosaic descriptions of DNA molecules, of dinosaurs, of animals that live now and lived in the past, of the swirling cosmos that we're talking about with the Big Bang. So it's up there, and it's in our basilica, the description of the natural world. So it's part of our church. It's part of who we are.
Thank you so much to our 4 panelists. Thank you. I know there were other questions that we weren't able to get to, but I know they'll be here for at least a couple minutes after, so I'm sure they would be happy to speak with you. Again, thank you so much. I was very edified to hear so many things I didn't know about, but I learned a lot today, that we have you kind of in the church and that you're out there kind of being witnesses to our Lord in these fields where maybe he isn't thought of or spoken of often. But so thank you for the gift of yourselves to this time. So.
Thank you all. Enjoy your time here.